The Transcontinental Railroad by Cecilia Bailey and Jillian Bobby.
Take a few minutes and close your eyes. Now try to imagine what American life was like during the 18th century, a time when there was no technology, no cars, and no paved roads, a time when the United States was just beginning. A lot of people living now overlook and take for granted all the amazing technological and economical advances we have made and how greatly they have impacted America. During those times, if you wanted to travel somewhere, you would have to walk, go by horseback, or go in a horse-drawn wagon. The journeys were long, cramped, uncomfortable, and many times resulted in tribal ambush, illness, and even death with no immediate access to medical care.
Now imagine a bellowing train whistle, a big steam engine chugging down the tracks and pulling into the town station. People from all the way across the country stepping out with their luggage. The birth of the Transcontinental Railroad changed transportation of people and things very dramatically. This railroad was a new kind of transit built across the continent. Because of it, Americans could ride comfortably, arrive at places much quicker, and spend considerably less to do it. It also stimulated the exploration of the western frontier, paved the way for future developments in transportation, technology, and environment, and united the entire country as one.
It all started with an idea in the 1830s. The government wanted transportation that would span all the way across the continent and connect the coast. It took many years to convince the government to make the time and spend the money to build a railroad as an alternative for the transportation they were looking for. Some of the main political figures fighting for the construction of the railroad were President Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Judah, Grenville Dodge, Collis P. Huntington, Leland Stanford, and Charles Crocker.
Abraham Lincoln was the president at the time Congress was making the decision to build the railroad, from election in 1860 to his last term in 1865. Throughout his term, he worked in fidelity to ensure the Transcontinental Railroad's happy ending. Theodore Judah was often called the father of the Central Pacific Railroad. His enthusiasm mixed with his undivided attention and knowledge gave the project a really great start. There was also a head engineer of the Union Pacific, Grenville Dodge. Later in his life, Grenville also became a congressman and continued to lobby for the railroad. Collis P. Huntington was also quite important. Collis was one of the 4 major investors of the Central Pacific Railroad, a smart and determined businessman. Once Judah shared with him his plans for this railroad, he helped Collis gather together Leland Stanford, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, along with other men, to form the Central Pacific Railroad Company.
In 1845, Asa Whitney presented Congress with a proposal to fund a project aimed to build a railroad across the country. The majority thought the railroad was not a good idea, so it was ignored. In the following couple years, the idea was buried but still remained unforgotten. It resurfaced again in 1860 with a man named Theodore Judah, who found a location he considered perfect for the railroad to proceed through. It was called the Donner Pass, a passageway through the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. Less than a year later, Judah had already appointed several entrepreneurs, lawyers, and engineers to his aid, forming the Central Pacific Railway Company. He and his entourage marched on to Washington and rallied to convince the government. It was a success. President Abraham Lincoln, along with other lawmakers in office, approved their idea. In 1862, President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act into play, authorizing land grants and bonds.
Once the government was convinced, it was time to plan out the route and logistics. President Abraham Lincoln confronted Dodge and said, "Dodge, what is the best route for a Pacific railroad to the west?" They conversed over the possibilities and decided. They also ended up picking 2 companies to build it, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. The Central Pacific would work east from Sacramento, California, and hire Chinese workers to build their share. The Union Pacific would start working in Omaha, Nebraska, and work westward. They hired the Irish and the African Americans to lay down their track. Since there was no specific meeting point for the 2 companies, both companies competed ridiculously, each one wanting to lay down more miles of track than the other company in order to receive more land grants and money.
The four bosses of the Central Pacific, Charles Crocker, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins, basically controlled the whole West. They were willing to do anything to earn more credit than Union Pacific. Due to the fact none of them had previous knowledge of railroads and that they were becoming too ruthless, Judah tried to plan their demise. He searched for other investors to buy them out, but his concerns were cut short because of his sudden death to yellow fever in 1863.
Meanwhile, in Union Pacific, Thomas Durant was controlling the entire company. He produced an illegal interest on the company, forcing them to do his bidding. In addition, he set up Credit Mobiler, which assured him trustworthy profits from the manufacturing of the railroad. Although Union Pacific and Central Pacific began building in 1863, little development took place until the Civil War was over. Because of opposition and resentment in the North and South, the meager thought of the Transcontinental Railroad was delayed until the United States was united again.
By May of 1866, the war had ended. Subsequently, Grenville Dodge became head of the Union Pacific, helping them to work much quicker. Skeptics began to organize attacks to sabotage the project and its workers, resulting in breakouts of violence and fatalities. Although disruptions occurred, the Union Pacific's track laying went swiftly compared to the Central Pacific. Like the Union Pacific, the Central Pacific had to work through harsh weather conditions. However, they had the added struggle of drilling through the treacherous mountains, resulting in a slower pace. The Central Pacific ended up laying down 742 miles of track, while their competitors finished with 1,038 miles of track.
On May 10, 1869, thousands of people gathered in Promontory, Utah to celebrate something very special. On May 10, 1869, history was made. The heads of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific companies met each other in Promontory to finish off the Transcontinental Railroad. A final spike was fashioned and driven into the ground on the point. Immediately after, several telegraph messages were sent out announcing the wonderful news. The first Transcontinental Railroad was finished, and the rail lines were connected. The West and the East were finally united.
This railroad enhanced America's communications, transportation, and new inventions. If the United States had never built this railroad, people in our country would never have expanded to the West. We would not have the technology that we have today. The Transcontinental Railroad is what paved the way for new and improved ways of transportation and what extremely boosted the United States economy. It was necessary for the United States to be who we are today.
The Transcontinental Railroad directly represents this year's National History Day theme, exploration, encounters, and exchanges. Because it spanned across the entire country, this railroad led the way for ample exploration of the West, which before then was sparsely inhabited. Although there were people and minimal trains subsiding at the West at the time, there was extreme separation between the eastern and western parts of the United States, and therefore no rail lines joining them together. Once the need for a connection between the two had been fulfilled, more people were willing to communicate with the distant West and maybe even live there.
It also forced Americans to encounter improved modes of transportation and different styles of living. Before the railroads, traveling was expensive and troublesome. By building the Transcontinental Railroad, people could travel where they pleased at a minimum fee and manageable duration, encountering modern styles of living and people.
The Transcontinental Railroad brought many new jobs and experiences to the United States. Due to the Transcontinental Railroad, a bond was created between the two halves of America, and people began to exchange ideas and interests. In conclusion, the Transcontinental Railroad was essential to America's growth. Thanks to the effects of this railroad, we can enjoy the little things that we so often take for granted.